this and to all the lectures of our Gedolim, our Giants of Judaism series. Hope that everybody enjoyed. This is the finale. This is the finale of the Ashkenazim. That's true. There'll be a separate series called Chacham Ovadia starting next week. That may last weeks. That may last years. You don't know. So, when noted author and educator Rabbi David Landesman arranged a meeting for his students with Professor Willie Lowe, an Israel Prize-winning recipient in science, chairman of the Department of Physics at Hebrew University, and founder and director of the Institute of Science and Halacha, better known as Machon Lev. The Rabbi Landesman, pointed out to his students that Professor Lev had the distinguished honor of studying both with Einstein at Princeton University as well as with the Chazon Ish. Professor Lev spoke to the boys about Torah and science. When he finished, he asked them if they had any questions. One boy raised his hand and asked, "In your opinion, who was more brilliant, Einstein or the Chazon Ish?" Professor Lev reflected for just a moment and responded, "I would say, in terms of asking questions, they were equal. But in terms of providing answers, the Chazon Ish was head and shoulders above Einstein. I could imagine anybody being head and shoulders above Einstein, unless they were really tall, maybe. The Chazon Ish, by virtue of his Torah knowledge, had a more profound ability," said Professor Lev, "to discern the truth." Tonight's shiur is about this profound ability that the Chazon Ish had to discern the truth. Not just as a standard Torah scholar discerns the truth, as you or I open up a sefer and we try to mine through the different commentaries and the ideas presented by the Torah. But more than that, the Chazon Ish had a heat-seeking radar to define what is true and what is not. And he had a passion for it that was unparalleled. But we first would be remiss without at least discussing some of his history. The Chazon Ish was born avraham yishaya karelitz, not the Chazon Ish, just as the Chafetz Chaim was not born Chafetz Chaim, in Kosovo, which was a town then in Poland, White Russia, in Cheshvan in the year 1878. Young Avraham learned Torah mostly from his distinguished father, and it wasn't long before he was known as a prodigy with a very bright future ahead of him. In fact, at his bar mitzvah, he made a declaration after his drasha that he will not take a penny for learning, and he will dedicate his entire life to learning only for the sake of heaven. And he kept that promise till the day that he passed. The Chazon Ish never held a position of any kind, not as chief rabbi of a state or city or town, nor as a rosh yeshiva or a melamed, not even as a teacher. He was just a simple man who learned in his house, who so happened to be the premier Talmid Chacham of his generation, and as we have seen, probably the most brilliant man alive at his time and maybe in a long time. The Chazon Ish married a lady who managed a small textile shop. The Chazon Ish, who was an accomplished mathematician, would often help with the finances and accounting for the business whenever necessary, and the shop continued to support them during the early years of their marriage while they lived in Minsk, White Russia. After World War I, the Chazon Ish moved to the city of Torah, also known as Vilna in Lithuania, home of the famed Gaon of Vilna in generations past, and then home to the foremost Talmid Chacham in Posek, Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grzensky. The revered Rabbi Chaim Ozer encouraged the reluctant Chazon Ish, Rabbi Avraham Yeshaya, to take a more active role in the rabbinate, so that his brilliance could benefit the Jewish people more. And slowly the Chazon Ish became a Rav who was not only inwardly concerned with affairs of the community, but also outwardly participating in communal affairs, as long as such commitments did not affect his learning too severely. Soon after, in 1933, the Chazon Ish made a decision to move to Eretz Yisrael. He was passionate about having the opportunity to perform many of the mitzvos, like Shemitah and Trumos Maasros, giving tithes to and certain other obligations that can only be done in Israel. And he wanted to have the opportunity to perform those mitzvos and to learn Torah in the Holy Land. And rather than live in an established city or neighborhood like Yerushalayim, let's say, the Chazon Ish chose to live in the yet unknown suburb of Tel Aviv we today refer to as Bnei Brak. I suppose most of you are thinking you know or have heard of Bnei Brak, once or twice, and would hardly consider it a pioneer town for a Torah true Jew to live in. And today, you are all correct. But all of that is due to the influence of this great tzaddik and Torah scholar through force of his sincere desire to help Klal Yisrael keep the Torah and mitzvos, and his commitment to the most perfect performance of those mitzvos and adherence to halacha in general. Halacha, of course, its philosophy, its observance, and its process form the foundation of the Chazon Ish. Many or most yeshivas today are satellites or products of the influence of what is called the brisk yeshiva system. The founder of that movement, Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik of Brisk, emphasized deep abstract thought and categorical logic in order to explain various concepts mentioned in the Talmud and its commentaries. The result of that method of teaching is twofold. First, the aim of the Brisk method is to develop the mind to understand concepts in halacha rather than to apply them to practical cases. Secondly, yeshivas do not exclusively study practical halacha as the bedrock of their in-depth studies. To the Chazon Ish, while this brisker approach of categorical, logical, scientific thinking was attractive in that it rewarded brilliant thinkers and helped them become active participants in the learning and the development of Torah, it was fundamentally flawed in his mind. Because in the zeal to reward the novel and brilliant chiddush, a novel new concept, it abandoned the skill of critically reading the Talmud and its commentaries to see what they had to say, rather than to try to find a source for what they, the students, were already thinking. Therefore, from the perspective of Torah learning as an end to itself, the Chazon Ish felt that the first priority was to understand fully and digest what the text had to say, and only then to begin to apply that knowledge to the halacha. Maybe most interestingly, though, the Chazon Ish believed that the diligent study of halacha, which included the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch and its commentaries, was not only about sharpening the mind and developing greater knowledge of the Torah, but the study of halacha for the Chazon Ish was essential to the development of morality in human beings. To paraphrase, he wrote, "What good is it for a man who understands that taking from others is wrong, yet out of ignorance to halacha doesn't know what the definition of theft is?" The Chazon Ish believed that we as human beings are given to making excuses and finding loopholes, like you've read, to justify our behavior as moral. Obedience to halacha, however, ensures that one does what is just, without listening to the machinations and calculations of his own mind. For the Chazon Ish, there was no need for musar or self-introspection. All that was needed was greater study and more adherence to the Shulchan Aruch. For those of you who have heard of the Chazon Ish, know a little bit about him, you probably know of his strictures in halacha, or certain atypical practices he maintained as vital to performance of certain mitzvos. Many of his conclusions and decisions in halacha are not accepted as the standard in the Orthodox world. But nevertheless, one cannot help but admire his sincerity in declaring his position and maintaining his halacha conclusions, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. One example is telling. Many of you are familiar with the story of the Mir Yeshiva, whose members and their families escaped the horrors of the Shoah, the Holocaust, through Japan to Shanghai, China. But while the yeshiva was settled in Kobe, Japan, they had a problem. Because when Yom Kippur arrived, and they were so close to the date line, they didn't know which day to observe Yom Kippur, which day to fast. And there were all sorts of different suggestions made, and many questions were asked of the poskim, the deciders of halacha at the time. And the Chazon Ish declared without equivocation that for reasons he later enumerated in a separate sefer called Kuntras Yudchas Shos, where he masterfully illuminated the mathematics of the date line, Yom Kippur was absolutely on the following day in that part of Japan, the day that was supposed to be the day after Yom Kippur, and he ruled that they should eat without fear on that day, as in, not eat a little bit, just in case it's Yom Kippur, eat a full meal as if it were a regular day, and in fact, the day before Yom Kippur is a mitzvah to eat, and he held that that mitzvah would continue, and that they should eat on the day that they assumed was Yom Kippur. No other rabbi said that. No other rabbi was even close to as confident in rendering that decision. What led the Chazon Ish to his incomparable confidence in rendering a halachic decision? It was, of course, his commitment to truly understanding the meaning and the intent of the text. That's very clear from what we've seen. But it was also his meek nature and his distaste for personal honor that contributed to his objectivity. The Chazon Ish's main work is a comprehensive commentary on all areas of the halachic galaxy. For that, it should be praised as a masterpiece. There, of course, was only one problem. Under that painting, so to speak, there was no recognizable signature, just the word ish, Aleph, Yud, Shin, which for those in the know were his initials, Avraham, Yeshaya. That anonymity signaled that the Chazon Ish was bothered only with the pure search for truth, the search for truth that Einstein didn't reach, the profound ability to decide and define the truth in God's Torah and in all parts of our existence, and to seek the correct conclusions for all of the queries that were raised. It was pointed out that while a great many scholars often write in first-person terminology when suggesting their own novel, original interpretations, the Chazon Ish writes his thoughts with no introduction, as if they are the truth because they seek only to reflect the original intent of the author and the text being discussed. No, I think, maybe, it could be, none of that. To the Chazon Ish, the truth is the truth. And if it was the truth, he put it down, and he accepted it as the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And if it wasn't, he wouldn't put it down. He wouldn't write it at all. A speculation to him wasn't worth his time. It wasn't worth your time, so he didn't write it. He refused to take accolades for his work or gifts from admirers. In fact, a wealthy man in Chicago decided to build a house for the Chazon Ish, but he refused to live in it without paying rent. Such was his dedication never to accept a penny from his Torah. Not only was the Chazon Ish well versed in Torah and halacha, but he possessed a kind of seldom seen intuition when it came to communal affairs and other concerns some would consider to be outside the realm of halacha. The Chazon Ish was consulted, and his advice was more often than not put into practice. He helped build a number of yeshivos, mikvos, shuls, and other institutions, and very often anonymously. One of the most interesting areas of his expertise, recognized by many in the Chazon Ish, was his knowledge of medicine. Despite never having attended medical school, he was sought out by countless Jewish patients, seeking not only spiritual assistance, where people go normally to rabbis when, unfortunately, the prognosis is negative, but even practical medical guidance. According to the Chazon Ish, due solely to his mastery of Maseches Chulin, which deals with the laws of kashrus and by extension the anatomy of animals, the Chazon Ish was able to understand quite a bit about the body and medicine. Legend has it he diagrammed a complicated and to that point unknown brain surgery, the diagram of which is said to exist, but I tried to find it and couldn't. Despite his reverence for Torah study and halacha, the Chazon Ish prioritized acts of kindness and generosity and lived his life with remarkable dedication to helping others in need. When asked if his endeavors in kindness are encroaching upon his learning, which was so sacred to him, and what ought to be his proper balance, the Chazon Ish replied simply, to fully understand Torah, one must be refined. Refinement is attained only through performing acts of kindness. There is no spiritual forfeiture when we aid others. To the contrary, it itself is the very goal, the attainment of perfection. To conclude, although many or most Orthodox Jews did not live their lives in complete lockstep with the Chazon Ish, the mark he made on not only his generation, but all successive generations is undeniable. His remarkable scholarship, dedication to the building of a community, and the mitzvah observance of all Jews around the world are an inspiration to us all. If we could only take just a minute percentage of his dedication, his humbleness, his yiras shamayim, his love for Torah and Hashem, then our Jewish experience would be exponentially enhanced. And I posit in that merit, we would realize the coming of Mashiach speedily in our days. Thank you all for coming.